Yep, should we get started? So thank you all very much for coming along today. It's great to see so many people here, and I know some more people will join us over the next few minutes. Thanks for joining us for this LGBTQ plus History Month event. So it's centered around the Logbooks podcast. For those who don't know, I'm Derek Wan, and I co-chair the LGBTI Matters Staff Forum along with Hannah Smith. And we're delighted to be joined by Tash Walker and Adam Zmith today, who've been making these podcasts since 2019, along with their colleague Shivani Dave. The logbooks that are talked about are actually the archives of the London LGBTQ plus Switchboard, which were kept by volunteers from 1974 until 2003. Tash is a co-chair of the Switchboard, and Adam is a writer and former journalist. So with it being LGBTQ plus History Month, I find it's always an important time to reflect on how far things have changed for us in the LGBTQ plus community. And this year I've been thinking about this more than ever, and I think it's to do with lockdown, and it's to do with things like Russell T Davis's It's a Sin being released on Channel 4, and so many of the topics that he covers in that particular drama series are covered in these logbooks. And LGBTQ plus History Month is also a good time for us to redouble our efforts to tackle bigotry and discrimination in society, especially within the LGBTQ plus community. So I've got a few housekeeping rules that we need to go through before we get started. Firstly, you'll be aware that this is being recorded and it will eventually be published on YouTube for people who can't join us today. We're going to hear a talk and discussion between Tash and Adam to start with, and then later on we'll open up to questions and answers. So if everybody keeps themselves muted to start with, that would be good. And if you do have a question you'd like to ask, you can use the raise hand function in Zoom, and we'll come to people who've raised their hands later on. But if you'd prefer to put it in the chat box, we will try our best to read some of those out later. And live captioning is available. It's already turned on my screen, and if it's not turned on yours, you're looking for the CC button at the bottom of the screen. If you can't see it, it might be hidden behind the More button. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Adam and Tash to let them get on with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek. Hi, everyone. My name is Adam. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm one of the co-hosts and co-producers of the logbooks.
And hi, everyone. I'm Tash Walker. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm the other co-host and a third of the co-producers of the logbooks. So we're going to kick things off with a clip from the podcast.
April the 1st, 1979, 1:04 a.m. Got a silent caller to speak. He started to do the heavy breathing bit, so I gave him the usual spiel about what Switchboard is all about. I was going to put the phone down, but I could hear he was still there. So I said, "Please speak to me." And he said, "I'm gay." Spoke to him again and said it was great to be gay, when he said, "I've got to go now," and hung up.
Still to this day, we get people calling Switchboard who aren't able to say anything. The volunteer uses the methods that are described in this logbook entry, and then you'll just hear, "I'm gay," or "I think I'm lesbian," or "I think I'm trans," and the call ends. And you as the volunteer could have been the first person that they've ever said that to.
Thanks for playing that, Adam. So that's a clip from the Logbooks podcast. For those of you who aren't familiar with the podcast, the way that we talk about it is that it's untold stories from Britain's LGBTQ plus history and conversations about being queer today. So we thought it would be good to start the presentation today by telling you how the podcast came about. So as Derek mentioned earlier, I'm one of the co-chairs of Switchboard, the LGBT plus helpline. But I've been a volunteer for nearly 10 years now, which is such a long time when I think about it. But I came across the logbooks when I was rifling around in the attic at Switchboard one day. This is when Switchboard wasn't particularly well organised, as you can imagine. Lots of things stuffed into boxes. There was a potential flood issue, which is why I went up and started looking through things. But as I was going through all of these old papers, I came across the logbooks and opened them up and was just completely overwhelmed by what I was seeing in front of me. So what we did then was thanks, Adam. So what we've got here is, on the right-hand side, we've got this very first logbook. Now, the logbooks go from 1974 to 2003. And what they are is this written record of the calls that the volunteers took, but also this wonderful conversation between the volunteers, which, at 1 minute, it's about how best to support someone who's just called up and has found out that they've got HIV and they are totally freaking out and think they've got weeks to live, through to a volunteer moaning about no one doing the washing up in the sink. It's such a fantastic book. It's the best book that I know Adam and I have ever read. You're laughing 1 minute, crying the next. So what we did was move this archive to Bishopsgate Institute. So that's the picture in the top left hand. That's the vaults at Bishopsgate Institute, and on the left hand side, nearest to the perspective of the camera, are the logbooks. And there's so many of them, and I just couldn't wait to get my hands on them. And so I spent about 2 years reading the logbooks, with silent tears falling down my face, and then laughing uncontrollably the next. And after about 2 years, I gave a presentation 2 years ago in 2019 at LGBT History Month now, almost to the day actually, which is quite, I hadn't thought about that, Adam, when I very first met you. That's our anniversary, I guess. And at this presentation, I was effectively talking about these amazing things that I found in the logbooks. To quote a previous volunteer of Switchboard and founder of Stonewall, Lisa Power, the milestones of the LGBTQ+ communities can be traced in the calls that Switchboard has taken. And it was at this presentation that Adam came up to me.
Yeah, I mean, I was just listening to the presentation because it's the kind of thing that I go to in LGBT History Month on a rainy Tuesday night. And I was not affiliated with Switchboard or anything like that. And I was sort of, I would go to that kind of event anyway, but I was also starting to shop around for like projects to work on. And I was just really completely like transfixed by the stories that Tash was telling from the logbooks, and the idea of tracking the milestones in our history through these calls, because these calls are obviously very confidential, and these are people's private lives. And that, to me, the combination of the privacy of that, the intimacy of those calls, and on the other hand, the bigger, broader picture of like LGBTQ+ life in Britain, the combination of those just, to me, sounded like a podcast. And so I just walked up to Tash at the end of the presentation and basically was like, can we make a podcast? Hello, can we make a podcast, please, together? So I obviously had to start, I mean, there was some courtship there, but then
you gave me your card, Adam.
After that period, when we were going ahead with it, I had to spend some time in the archive, like getting familiar with it, also getting familiar with the Switchboard history, as well as this, is this helpline that has helped people with everything to do with gender identity and sexuality since '74. So I had to kind of get familiar with that and get familiar with the archive, and then we started working out how we were going to tell these stories. We've also got another picture, haven't we, Tash? Maybe you want to, oh, here's some more pictures. Yeah, these are, yeah.
Okay, so just, I'll jump back to Adam in a second, but to give you a bit of context, here are some wonderful things that are also in the archive, as well as, papers and general minutes. You've got the logbooks and you've got so many fantastic pictures. These are all 3 pictures, which are in the old phone room, which was above Houseman's Bookshop, which is a bookshop in King's Cross in London. A very anarchistic bookshop that has been the centre of many movements, including the Gay Liberation Front, which came around a little bit before Switchboard. But this is above Houseman's. You can see just all of those pages of books and everything just jam-packed, the hustle, the bustle. You get this real energy of what it must have been like for the volunteers to be taking calls And these are actually the pictures that the phone room for the helpline and It's a Sin are based on. So the helpline is actually effectively Switchboard, although unnamed in that TV show. And on the top left picture, the person in the spotted shirt, that's actually a very young Lisa Power who I mentioned earlier.
And Lisa's voice is one of the many voices that you can hear in the podcast. We've interviewed, well, we think about 50 contributors. So the podcast is comprised of a few different elements, really. There's readers reading logbook entries, which we anonymize and make sure that we can keep them confidential, such as the one that you heard at the beginning. And then there are voices of people like Lisa, who were former volunteers, talking about the stories. And there are also voices of all sorts of different people who have just lived their LGBTQ plus lives, and where their stories and themes intersect with the themes in the podcast. And then the final layer is like Tash and me reflecting and kind of gossiping about these things. And should we give an idea of, we talk a bit more about some of the things that are in the logbooks and some of the stories that we've covered. So if I move on to the next picture, Tash, do you want to talk about it?
Oh yeah, let's delve straight into one of my
quiz. We'll do a quiz on it at the end.
Yeah, this is one of my all-time favorite logbook entries. I remember, so our Bishopsgate Institute is this massive library. It's brilliant. No one talks, it's silent. Everyone's working. They're looking at all of these fantastic archives. I turn a page, it's a Wednesday evening, and I see this, and it's just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. 16th of October, 1976, a guide to the handkerchief code. I don't know if many of you know what this is. If you do, brilliant. If not, the handkerchief code was a way that gay men used to signal to each other, one, that they were gay, and two, what kind of sex they were up for. So it's just fantastic. I'm going to highlight two of my favorites. So it all depended on what colour hanky you wore and in which pocket. So if you wore it on your left hip pocket, this was a sign that you were butch and sadistic. Right hip pocket, that was passive and masochistic. So the black handkerchief meant left hip pocket, you were a whipper. Right hip pocket, what else? A whippy. And then my all-time favourite, still yet to this day have I found someone who can speak to this experience, but I will continue looking, is puce, which is about halfway down. And if you wear it in the left hip pocket, it means unlimited, you're up for anything, but you want to discuss pre-Columbian art first. And if you wear it on the right hip pocket, you're looking for a discussion in pre-Columbian art. It's just brilliant. And I love this. And it's such a wonderful insight into the logbooks, because it shows not only was this, there's so much information that needed to be shared and that people wanted, but there's this real humor and joviality throughout the whole of the logbooks, sort of a survival technique as well, I think, for the communities. But yeah, do you want to? Yeah,
I still don't know what puce actually is as a colour, but
it's like yellowy green.
Okay. And so the I think what's one of the things that we've realized making the podcast, and we try to build into the podcast, is the sort of the ways that we as a community live our lives. So this hanky code, I mean, it was it's a real thing. I think some of the entries on this page are kind of a little bit of a parody, a little bit funny, but it's really interesting to think about the codes and the rules, the etiquettes of how we live. And one thing that we do in the podcast is always reflect on how those things are today. And so today we have in this case, gay men, they maybe don't use hankies anymore, but they have hashtags and keywords in their Grindr or Scruff profiles and stuff like that about what they will or won't do. So we're always kind of trying to think about the links between the olden days and today, and this is always a shifting thing. And so each of the episodes, we've made 2 seasons now. The first season covered 74 to 82, and the second season, which has just finished being released, covered 80 to 83 to 91. And each season has several episodes, and each episode is a different theme that we've found through the logbooks. And so, Tash, should we play the next clip?
Definitely.
So this clip comes with a content warning that it discusses suicide, and I think that's actually also in the clip itself. But this is an example of the kind of call that Switchboard handled and the kind of stories that we tell in the podcast.
It must be so hard to have been one of those teachers feeling so trapped that you couldn't support those kids in that way.
And then on the other side, there's the young person who might be suffering privately and finding it difficult to find someone to talk to, or just not daring to talk to anybody for whatever reason. We've actually got a logbook entry about that, someone phoning Switchboard. And just to warn you that this logbook entry mentions suicide.
This is a logbook entry from March the 9th, 1986. The volunteer who took the call was Pete. Today, I took what I consider to be my first ever serious suicide call from a young teenage boy called Jay, whose mother found out that he was gay and won't let him out the house except to go to school. Nothing I could say seemed to persuade him that things could possibly get better. But in the end, I got him to concede that he ought to give himself a chance and should talk to Parents' Inquiry or one of the gay youth groups. He said he would ring back and let us know how he got on, or if he needed more suggestions. So if anyone gets a call from an Asian teenager called Jay from Neasden, please let me know.
And I think this is probably a good point for us to talk about the confidentiality of the archive as well. So in that's obviously a very personal story, and the many reasons that people reached out to Switchboard historically and still to this day is because it's a confidential helpline. So we knew that was a really important thing for us when we were making the podcast. So what you heard in that clip, although it does give identifying names and places, we completely changed all of them. And because Switchboard is a national helpline, we were able to change the location from being somewhere in the north of Scotland to the south of England, and the person's names to protect their identity, but still to get across that really powerful story. And every story that we tell in the podcast, they're all based on the themes and the work that we've done in looking through the archive. So this is just one story that you'll hear, but it is representative of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of calls that Switchboard has taken. And this is such a prime example of one. And even calls like this still happen today at Switchboard. It's about someone not being accepted within their home, not feeling comfortable within their supposedly safe space. Things that we are probably thinking a lot more about today because of what's been happening over the last year as well. So it's a really important thing for us to be able to reflect on and listen and hear, because it allows us to have an insight into the struggles and the difficulties that many people have faced in being LGBTQ+ throughout the years, and what we can all do to learn more, so that we can help and support people better. And we've certainly learned so much throughout our time in making this podcast. And something specifically that I learned about from season 1 that I had actually no idea was around the custody battles that many LGBT people face, but particularly lesbian women who would come out. They would tell their husband they would divorce, but in doing so, it was very, very common that their partners, their husbands, would then take them to the court and they would lose custody of their children. The courts were more likely to side with the husband if there had been issues of domestic abuse, domestic violence even, than they would to give the custody to the mother if she were a lesbian. And I was so shocked when I heard about that. And it was really amazing to speak to one of our contributors who had exactly that same thing herself. And of course, the way that she talks about it was so interesting because it's a double-edged sword. Not only do you have to go and fight for the custody of your child, but you also have to come out publicly and say that you are gay, which of course is difficult for anyone at any point, and we all have our own individual experiences and stories, but especially back in the 70s. So yeah, that really hit home for me.
Yeah, one of the stories that I learned a lot about was about the police intimidation and persecution, really, of gay men especially. I hadn't really realized that it was so prevalent and so awful. We mainly cover that in the podcast in the sort of late 70s period, although it happened through the 80s into the 90s as well. And so we spoke to people who had experience of being in public toilets to try to find sex. One of the reasons for that is just because that was, for many people, the only place that they could go for sex, or where they felt able to get sex and have sex. Obviously, some people also just enjoy that. And police would turn up, arrest people. They would sometimes entrap people. There's the saying, the pretty policeman, and they were sort of the cutest, I don't know, most sexiest police guys who would wear plain clothes and entrap men into doing like sex things or kissing or whatever, and then they could arrest them for soliciting or acts of gross indecency. And one of the things that we found in the logbooks very frequently in the 70s especially were calls from people who this had happened to, or who were regulars in certain cruising areas, like certain public loos, certain cottages like on Charing Cross Road in London, or Hampstead Heath in London, or other places, not just in London. And they would call Switchboard to say, oh, the police are very active in this area right now, so can you advise callers who are looking for places to cruise not to go to those places? And there was also advice on what to do if you were arrested or intimidated by the police. And there was the recommendation to speak to a lawyer, and Switchboard had a lawyer whose name is David Offenbach, who was one of the lawyers that Switchboard would often refer people to if they needed legal advice or representation about this. And he's actually one of the very few people that we traced from the logbooks. We certainly didn't try to trace any callers, we wouldn't, but he was a sort of semi-volunteer with Switchboard. So we actually managed to find him, and there's an episode where we interview him and other people about that subject in season 1,
which was called Pretty Policeman, which of course was also the name of a fundraising ball that Switchboard held in the 80s. So I really always love that reclaiming of the language.
Yes.
We've got a logbook entry which I think covers importuning. If you want to bring that up to show. I think it's slide 15.
Wait. Custody. No. I think it might be one at the end, Tash.
Yeah, I think it's number 15.
Yeah. Here we go. This one.
Yeah.
Throughout this time, with the increase in the number of calls that were coming through to Switchboard, reporting police raids or police attacks, Switchboard's role quickly started to become much more of an advice-giving service as to what to do if you were attacked, going on to specifically naming solicitors that you could get in contact with.
There's a piece of paper pasted into the logbook on September 14th, 1976, which is typed, it's clearly on a typewriter, typed memo to volunteers about what they should do if the police actually started questioning them as volunteers of Switchboard. And it's entitled, Don't Ask a Policeman. And it says, in the event of the police, uniform or plain clothes, calling at the premises in pursuit of any inquiries, the following courses of action should be adopted by the volunteer on duty. And there's a whole list of things, such as, number 1, don't let them in unless they've got a warrant. And also, number 3, if they've got a warrant, examine it. And if it's valid, let them in, but phone David Offenbach immediately. Also inform the chairperson. And number 4 is, you must not make any statement without David Offenbach present.
I'm David Offenbach. I'm a solicitor. I'm 75 years old. I was very active in the 1970s and 1980s in representing people who were charged with gross indecency.
There you go. Shall we talk, Tash, a bit about HIV there? Because we've got that other
perfect
here. That this is another picture from the logbook from the 7th of March. I forgot what year this one was, but obviously you can date it by the fact that it talks about an AB positive test, which means antibody positive, which means that it's the same as being as having an HIV positive test result. And this person had that test and got no counselling at all, and his lover had died of AIDS 3 weeks ago. And he called to talk to me, and I said, call back anytime. Please be gentle with him. He's scared, stupid. So the fact that it's AB positive test, and the fact that it's you can tell that clearly this is you can date this by sort of like the mid 80s, just by those things, and you can tell the sort of status of the epidemic at that point, that this was running wild, and it was beginning to be a real health crisis and a real crisis for individuals as well. So they turned to Switchboard.
Yeah, it's a quite an amazing period of time for the organisation, where they were I don't think anyone was aware of what was about to hit. But there was one point, I mean, a bit later, in 1987, where the government focused their thoughts and time around the AIDS Don't Die of Ignorance campaign, which is the one with all of that provocative music and the tombstone advert. And as part of that, they sent out a leaflet, which was sent to every single household in the country. And on that leaflet was a couple of numbers, including Switchboard. And Switchboard only found out the night before that its number was even on it. And needless to say, the phone lines were completely overwhelmed, and they broke. And this brings me to something as well, that many of the stories that we include in the logbooks from our contributors and volunteers that we speak to who are part of Switchboard throughout these years, they're often things that I heard when I was working on the archive at Bishopsgate, these sorts of snippets and hearsay stories. One of them was around the HIV AIDS crisis, and it was about how BT refused to come in to Switchboard to fix the phone lines because the engineers thought they were going to get AIDS. And equally, there's another story about a TV crew coming to cover the increase in calls to the organisation, who, as soon as they find out where they are, they literally drop their equipment and leave. And Lisa, again, tells us about how the Switchboard volunteers held on to the equipment as ransom until they decided to pull their finger out and come back. But it's a real insight to the attitudes at the time. And what was additionally complex for the Switchboard volunteers throughout this period, not only are there so many calls that are incredibly difficult to handle, people finding out that they themselves have been diagnosed HIV positive, learning out that their partners have, their loved ones, learning how to support them, how to help people effectively deal with the finding out that they have HIV. It's an incredibly complex thing, and that's one thing that Switchboard's always been. That's from the community for the community, and Adam will speak to this probably more in a second, but there was so little unknown during this period of time that the people contracting HIV themselves became the experts, and they would call Switchboard for not only to give them information about what the most up-to-date things were around the medical advancements at this time, or the understanding and knowledge, but the Switchboard volunteers started to collate that information themselves, and they went on to form the basis of many HIV charities, including the National AIDS Manual. But yeah, Adam.
Yeah, I also just want to remind anyone who's watching and listening that they can ask us questions like anytime by just putting something in the chat, or I can't quite see the chat because I'm doing the screen share thing. So I hope someone else is just watching that and can shout out if someone's there wanting to ask us questions. The other thing that was going on at Switchboard, of course, at the time well, Switchboard is this very like self-reflective organization, and Tash would talk to this as being someone who is in quite long discussions with fellow volunteers about how things should run. But certainly that's a theme in the logbooks. And so we've made sure to cover that in the podcast, not because it's a podcast about Switchboard. It is very much a podcast about the LGBTQ plus community, but actually because that theme can be served somewhat by talking about what was going on inside Switchboard as this like microcosm of life. I sometimes think how like soaps, you know, like Coronation Street is like the microcosm of Britain, like it's set up to be like that. It's got all the different kind of character types on this one street, and on this one street, and Switchboard probably is a bit like that for the LGBT community. However, it has not always been like fully inclusive and representative of everybody. You know, first it was gay Switchboard, then it was lesbian and gay Switchboard. Now it is Switchboard dash the LGBT plus helpline. But during the 80s especially, there are quite like severe issues and tensions between volunteers about bisexual people and about transgender people, and because you had to be gay or lesbian to be a volunteer at Switchboard, when bisexual people presented themselves and transgender people presented themselves, that caused some problems. And so it's really interesting to also reflect back on those stories as well, and hear the words of those people. I don't know, Tash, maybe you want to say some of those actual stories from some of the people, from some of the contributors, and what they faced.
Yeah, 100%. And this is something that was really important to us when we were making the podcast, and also to me personally as someone who's a part of the charity today, is that I think that there's real power in looking back throughout history and understanding it with all of its positive and negative attributes, recognizing that any community, sub-community, marginalized community, charity, whatever, any organization is always a reflection on wider society. And Switchboard certainly was that. So there were issues around sexism within the 70s, and there were issues around biphobia in the 70s, 80s and 90s, and transphobia throughout this period of time, because that was a reflection of wider society. Not to say that none of those things don't exist today, they absolutely do. But we have seen a significant shift in the right direction, although of course we have so much more work to do. But what's important is that, and this is very prevalent with it being LGBT History Month, is that this is why history is so important. We have to look back and we have to learn so that we can own our mistakes as society and recognize why those things were wrong, and use them to be able to inform us for a more equal, more fair society in the future. So when I found out about the biphobia that had existed within the organization, I was initially shocked, and then upon reflection I understood why those things were happening at that point. But it was certainly something I didn't want to hide away from, and we wanted to give a platform to it within the podcast, because there were bisexual people within the organization who became victims of that biphobia, and there were one of the first ever transgender volunteer who is actually intersex but didn't have the knowledge at the point to identify in that way, joined Switchboard in the 80s, and a group of women left the organization because they would not be part of an organization where a transgender person was considered to be a lesbian. And it's so interesting looking back at those stories and hearing from those people, especially with what's been happening in the more recent history, when you're looking at the progress we're trying to make around transgender issues. But what's really powerful is that those stories are there and they have to be shared, and that those people are willing to talk about it. And there's such strength in that, and that's what you really pull from the logbooks specifically, is the strength of the people within the LGBTQ plus communities. Yes, that's the activists, and yes, that's those loud people, but volunteers at Switchboard, some were marching down the street, some were protesting, but actually what they did is they turned up for their shift weekly and picked up that phone as an anonymous person and helped those people who contacted Switchboard, no matter what their identity, no matter what their sexuality. And I think that's something that I've certainly been thinking a lot about recently. And I know that we've spoken about, Adam, is those sort of unsung heroes who aren't your sort of typical activists when you look back through history.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we definitely tried to do in the podcast when we do the research in trying to find the contributors, is really looking for people who are not the obvious candidates, not the most visible people. Like we've already mentioned the words Lisa Power like at least 3 times on so far on this in this talk, and she is an absolute absolute diamond, like amazing person, and has done so much for all of us. And has been very out and loud and proud and working hard on everything for decades and decades, and still going strong if you follow her on Twitter especially. And she's wrong on some things to do with Star Trek, I have to say, but like that path. But although we've got people like Lisa, like, you know, there are the LGBTQ plus community is just also, like, for the vast majority, it's just people living their lives. And so that's one thing that we try to do in, you know, in research and finding contributors, is those people who just had stories to tell about their lives. And it's been interesting to us to experience quite a lot of contributors who have said, like, well, why do you want to talk to me? Or, well, I can tell you stuff that was going on for me in 1979 or 1989, but you know, I wasn't important. I wasn't on a march. I wasn't volunteering at Switchboard or anything like that. I was you know, I was just trying to be me, or trying to hide that I was me, or whatever, and then gradually coming out, whatever. So it's really important to hear those stories, and I think that's another way of thinking about LGBT History Month, or I mean, thinking about LGBT history, full stop. And we should do it for more than just 1 month, of like thinking, well, you know, history is the things that's recorded, and we're lucky that we have the logbooks, the actual logbooks, and then we've obviously converted them somewhat into a podcast, which is like recorded and available wherever you get your podcasts. But until we had that, you know, we have all the history books, and then it wasn't until very recently, really recent decades, where LGBT history full stop has been recorded in the like official places. So most of the time we're just working with people's lives and trying to record what they're up to. And I think that that's something, that's another way of thinking about history, basically, because our podcast isn't even about a period that's very old, you know. There's nothing in our podcast that's that's older than 1974. So yeah.
But you're right, completely right, Adam. This is, you know, in the words of so many heritage organisations, at-risk heritage.
Yeah.
And one person we really wanted to speak to for the Logbooks podcast was a founding member of Switchboard. His name was David Seligman.
Yeah.
But he was very ill. He was paraplegic in the last couple of years that we tried to reach out to him, and he died 2 weeks ago. So he is no longer here, and that was someone we weren't able to capture because the project started later. So there's a real responsibility that we all felt as producers, Adam, Shivani and I, that I think especially as queer people ourselves, that we had a responsibility as a younger generation to learn from our elders, to listen to them, to hear their stories, and to give them a platform to share them. And it was certainly a very anxiety-making research experience for us all. I know before season 1 came out, I was probably ringing Adam up almost every hour to make sure that we've done this thing or done that thing. But I think we've done an okay job, which is something. But it's and actually maybe it's worth just mentioning that the response that we've had from older members of our communities, whether we've included them specifically in the podcast or they've just listened to it, has been really very touching and very overwhelming. And when you were talking about the activist, or what is it to be an activist, it reminded me of Catherine. And Catherine was someone we spoke to. Her story is around being a teacher throughout Section 28 era. And she tells a story about going on a protest, but having to hang back, and that's why is her story as important to share. She's not really an activist. And, you know, we spoke a lot about this, and you know, and Adam's touched on it already, but just being LGBTQ plus, whether you're out or not, there's such strength in that, and it's all part of our history, and all of those people have had an impact on certainly Adam and I and other younger generations of LGBTQ plus people today, and we're, you know, forever grateful for them.
The other interesting thing about Catherine, which is not actually included in the podcast, is a story. So this is a person who was like very quite shy in telling her story about her personal life and everything. And but as I was talking to her more and more, she started to talk about something that happened in her workplace in the mid-90s, I think it was. And so that's why it's not included in the podcast in season 2, because that only goes up until 91. But I just thought I'd mention it now because we're talking to you all and you're all in a workplace. I mean, I know you're all in your separate boxes, but you know, everyone's, you know, this is like a work LGBT network. So, and, you know, she worked for a pretty big company in a sort of not particularly powerful position. And it was a very male-dominated company in an office. And she was a lesbian who was working there, but was very much in the closet during that period. And she noticed that like a lot of the men had, you know, like pinup pictures and page 3 girls like dotted around their desks. And it just made her feel really uncomfortable, basically. And so she made a complaint. And I often think of like sometimes LGBT plus people are like the troublemakers in the workplace, you know, where sometimes the people that complain about things, and sometimes we're reluctant to do that because we're worried about what that's going to mean for us and stuff. But she made a complaint, and the complaint was basically rejected. She said these things make me feel uncomfortable, and the answer was, well, you could put up pictures of men if you want, like, you know, you can put up your pictures. Obviously that's not the best solution and the best management approach, but it came up again a second time when sometime after that, and because she persisted, and the policy was changed, and actually the policy became that no one was allowed to put anything personal up around their workstation. It's a sort of dehumanizing, scorched earth approach to that. But so that might not be the best solution in my opinion either, but nevertheless it was good that she did that. And it was funny that this is a person who was like, oh well, I didn't do anything important, you know, I was just living my life. And it's like, hang on a minute, you pressed for change in your workplace, you know. And that's obviously what you know, Hannah and Chris and Derek and every, you know, people involved in the network are doing as well. Do we have some questions? I've got some.
I think so. It does remind me of a story quickly before we go to the questions, of something that happened in Switchboard. And so this was Femi Ototoji, who is a pioneer. She's amazing, and she was a volunteer at Switchboard and was very vocal. And they had put up on the pin board a notice about why were there not more women volunteers at Switchboard? We've got to do a big recruitment drive. And an unknown gay man had pasted a poster of a naked guy on top of it, unintentionally, supposedly. And then on top of that, Femi then basically defaced this poster and called out the massive amounts of sexism that this was not only silencing them by literally putting that on top. So it's another really great, juicy story of this period of time where you had that inner turmoil at Switchboard around many different issues. But yeah, you're right, Adam. Should we have a look?
Yeah, so
wow.
someone has very thoughtfully given me a link to what puce looks like. Thank you, Emily.
Oh my God, amazing.
And then we've got a batch of questions from Jamie. So there's a few of them. Can you tell us a bit more about the creative process? How do you decide and research each of the topics? Maybe I could take those two, and then Tash, you could take the next
Yeah, sure.
Same chat. So the creative process and how we research. It starts with looking at the actual pages of the logbooks, as you can see on this slide. You know, just reading through these books and books and books, and I take pictures of logbook entries that are particularly interesting or on a theme which seems to be coming up again and again and again. And so I sit there in Bishopsgate Institute, ordering the archivist to go down the stairs and bring up these boxes of books, because I'm not allowed to go down there. So we have to do them one at a time. Oh, my slides have just disappeared. Oh, the host of shop was going. Yeah, and so I look through those logbook entries and take pictures, and then sort of start to kind of categorize them along those themes, like health or sex or nightlife or the police actions, etc. Obviously, HIV made lots of subcategories, and then Tash and me and Shivani then start to talk about batching those themes and batching those stories. And then we also, at the same time as that, are starting to do research in thinking, well, who can we speak to? So first of all, going to the people that we know who have memories of the time period and asking them if they'll speak to us. And that's obviously sometimes volunteers and sometimes not. And then also just doing call outs on social media, or asking everyone that we do speak to if they know somebody that we should speak to, and then collecting stories and then batching those stories into the same clusters as the logbook. So the logbook stories are the ones that we're led by. So that's why there are things that people tell us, which if they don't come up in the logbooks, then we don't cover them. That's just a constraint that we've set on ourselves. And then we make these very detailed plans of each episode. So which logbook entry we're going to include, which quotes from contributors we're going to include, because we transcribe all our interviews so that we can have the text of what they say, so that we can put them alongside the logbook entries. And then we put in a section where Tash and me are going to say something when we get in the studio and we do our bits. So Jamie, I hope that answers the question about the process. Tash.
Yeah, good overview there, Adam. I think as well, it's also just to add to that, like season 2 especially was incredibly emotional with the HIV and AIDS memories and time, and we all found that very touching and at times quite difficult. I know that when I was interviewing some of the people, I became choked up and welled up during those interviews, and then I would cry again when I listened back to the audio, and then I'd cry again in the studio. So it can be, it's certainly, I mean, I would never change any of it. It's wonderful, but there's a lot to learn, and it's just amazing to hear these stories from these people. I cannot tell you how much it means to us. But yeah, anyway, I'm going off on one. So what synergy have you two developed as hosts of the podcast? Oh, wow. So yeah, it was a bit of a risk, wasn't it, really? Adam and I deciding to work together after our first initial meet and a couple of weeks of courting.
It was a bit like, has anyone watched Married at First Sight Australia? Because it was a bit like that, where you sort of have to make a commitment really early on, and then deal with the consequences.
Quite old school, really, but it worked out okay, didn't it, Adam?
Yeah.
We've actually become, it's so nice. Adam and Shivani I consider two of my closest friends now, and really lucked out on not only finding a brilliant creative collaborator, but also a really good friend. So yeah, I'm very happy about that. And how did we bring Shivani into the mix? Excellent question. So Shivani was working for the BBC. I think she was working for Radio 4 when Switchboard turned 45, and I was doing a lot of work throughout the time I was reading the logbooks about trying to bring more awareness to Switchboard's archive and the amazing work that the organisation had done over the last 45 years at that point. So I was really trying to push this and reach out to a lot of journalists, and Shivani was one of those journalists who came and made a Radio 4 programme about Switchboard's 45th. And I could just tell how much they loved Switchboard. I could just see how they were falling in love with it and with these stories. So when Adam and I had built this sort of structure and decided what we wanted to do with the podcast, we thought, actually, this could be, it'd be really great to have another producer here, and let's bring Shivani on. And they said yes, so that worked out. Well. Oh, look, Peter says he assumed we'd been friends for years. I know. Well, what is time? What is time, Peter? We've got another question from Lucy. Section 28 is such an awful chapter in our nation's history. I wonder if any schools, teachers have been in touch with the logbook team or Switchboard volunteers to think about creating educational resources. Do you want to take this one, Adam?
Yes. So yeah, the answer is yes. And we've also been proactive in trying to do that as well. So we actually, one of the very first emails we got actually from a listener when we released season 1 was someone who said, basically, hello, I work in education and I'm a straight person, and I think that the podcast is a great resource, and I'm recommending it to to teachers and other people that work in education settings, and also the Jehovah's Witnesses that live next door. And so that was a really great email to receive, because we were like, well, first of all, we didn't know this person. We were just we hoped that our friends and family would listen to the podcast, but then it's really, really nice when you get emails from strangers as well who are listening. So that was really good. And then we actually followed up with that person, and Since then, we've also been working on an application for funding from the Heritage Fund to fund us for season 3. And so that is being decided right now as we speak. We'll hear in a few weeks' time whether we've got that funding. But as part of that application, we also said what we'd like to do is create resources for teachers and for young people. Because Lucy, you're right, Section 28 is an awful chapter. Tash and I are Section 28 babies. Our mandatory education took place under Section 28, so it would have been illegal for teachers to talk to us about LGBT. So we have to keep doing everything that we can to reverse that, make sure it doesn't happen again. So we actually got some agreements in principle with some organisations that work with schools and teachers, so that we can make some of those resources, and we put that proposal into the funding application. So hopefully we can get that money and we can do that.
Yeah, definitely. I actually got another request today, Adam, from a teacher asking if we'd got anything. So
great.
I said, watch this space, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
So we've got another question from Chris. How has Switchboard changed now in terms of the service it provides and some of the differences in terms of technology and people's habits compared to, good question, compared to the 70s, 80s and 90s? Well, 2003 was when the logbooks finally became computerized. So that gives you an insight into the technology advancements of Switchboard throughout this time. But I can confirm that in 2011, we launched instant messaging. So now we have a telephone, instant messaging and email service. Telephone is still the most popular way for people to contact us. We get around 17,000 contacts a year, the majority of which are on the phones, then instant messaging and then email. Email tends to be longer sort of more detailed stories and questions, and more often than not from outside of the UK. We get quite a number of emails from people who are in detention centres as well, which is very heartbreaking. And this year alone, to speak more specifically to what's happened, the increase in instant messaging has skyrocketed. That started in lockdown, and that was especially for people under the age of 16 contacting us because they didn't feel able to speak on the phone to reach out to the helpline volunteers because of being in lockdown in whatever situation. So that's how we manage things at the moment, but we are seeing a big increase on the instant messaging side of things too. I hope that answers those questions. Oh, but actually this reminds me, and I'm going to loop back around to the logbooks and some work from the archive, that maybe it's worth me speaking about what's really interesting and something that I found very pertinent, I know Adam and Shivani have too, is that throughout the changes in the themes, the changes in societal attitudes and legislation, throughout these years, there are always consistent calls and notes, logbook entries of people reaching out to Switchboard from the 70s, 80s, from the 90s, for people feeling afraid, feeling overwhelmed with shame and uncertainty because of something to do with their sexuality or gender identity. And those are calls that we still get today, people feeling isolated and lonely. And that's a real quite powerful thing to think about, that as far as we're going in time and with the changes in society and equality, there's still this stigma that sticks. But we are getting more calls from people who are outside of the communities who are wanting to learn how to be better allies and how to support people, which is just brilliant, I think.
Shall we play the sing-along clip, Tash?
Yes. Oh, because it's not, because there's lulls. There's lulls aplenty in the logbooks.
Yeah, it's not all doom and gloom and sadness and isolation. There are moments of joy and laughter among the volunteers at Switchboard and also just in our community, because we know how to have a good time and we know how to laugh. So let me see if I can find the clip, and it's going to let me share my screen again. One sec. Screen.
Just while you're doing that, Adam, I just wanted to say thank you so much for pouring light and for bringing the logbooks to life with such respect, dignity and kindness and sensitivity. I just think it's phenomenal. It's incredible the work that you've done.
Thanks very much. So here is here's another clip.
Tree.
This is a logbook entry from May 6th, 1984. The volunteer who took the call was Donna. I've just had 2 hoax calls from a bunch of 11-year-olds. The first time they rang, we had a very erudite conversation about Judy Garland. They then phoned back and serenaded me with a full version in tune of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Teeny Bob High Camp. Wonderful.
Yeah.
You know, that just reminds me of another thing, Adam. So when at the end of season 1, before the pandemic happened, we did a live episode recording where we brought some of the people that we'd interviewed, the volunteers, onto the panel. That Julian Howes and Femi Ototoji were 2 of those people. And we had this audience and we were talking and sharing logbook entries and hearing from the audience. And Julian was telling the story about how you'd get these prank calls from kids ringing up all crammed into a phone box and just like being like, oh, what's pansexual? Is it a pan? Ha ha ha. Or like gay, ha, like literally just saying that and then hanging up. And he said he always took them seriously. He always said, okay, yes, okay, interesting joke. But if any of you are gay or think you might be, then give us a call back. And then this guy puts his hand up in the audience and he said, I was one of those people who called you and did that. And then I did call back because I was gay. And it was like this incredible moment.
He might have been the one who was singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow.
I hope so.
Like in the photo.
Ask for a rendition.
Okay, any final questions from anyone? I've put in the chat, I've put links to either support Switchboard or donate to Switchboard or to support the podcast, and also links to the actual podcast if anyone wants to subscribe to the podcast. And but please do ask us any more questions, otherwise Tash is going to read you a poem. Well, actually she's going to read you a poem anyway to finish. And so
Adam, can I just butt in and thank you both again for doing this. It was really great, and I was pleased that we got over 30 people in at the highest point. I'm going to paste a link into the chat, which is the other University of York History Month events that are coming up. So if anybody wants to look at that, they're free to. But I'll hand back to you guys and we'll hear the poetry.
Yeah. Okay, great. And thanks very much to Hannah and Chris for organising, Derek for the lovely introduction, and everyone for being here. Oh, just before you do the poem, Tash, we've got some quick questions. Does Tom Fosget Barnes live score each episode? His music is so touching. Yes, I agree. The music, I think at least half of the joy of listening to the podcast is the music, I think. No, basically what happened was he was a composer that Tash already knew because he had interviewed her for another project that he was working on. And when we were putting together the podcast, we knew that we wanted to use music. And so Tash went to him and said, what do you think about music? And we didn't have any money or anything. So he said, why don't I just give you the rights to use some of the music that I've already made, and you can just do whatever you want with it. So we picked, I think there's about 3 tracks of his that we use, that we clip from, and we just use them over and over again in order to manipulate your emotions as you're listening.
Okay, and on that note, this isn't a poem I've written or anything. I wouldn't subject anyone to that. But it is, it's one of the things that's really difficult about being a volunteer, and has always been, is that you speak to someone on the phone and you have this really intimate connection with them. You know, they're sharing something they may never have shared with anyone before. And then you put the phone down and you have no idea what happens to them. Sometimes they call back, but most of the time you'll never know. And so occasionally we hear from people, and in the logbooks, I would find these little notes that, you know, people who'd called Switchboard had sent. And this particular one was from a previous caller who rang up and gave Switchboard a Valentine. So in the words of, I think his name was Thomas, here we go. Roses are red, violets are blue. Some like Brighton, Bristol, I like you. Sitting there hours on end, helping those who cannot fend for themselves in this cold land, giving them a helping hand. Voices soft, assuring warm, make us feel so safe from harm. Information gay galore, with all that talent you're bound to score. Roses are red, violets are blue, some like gay news, I like you.
Yay!
Thank you so much for having us today. It's been so fun. I've really enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you, University of York.
Yeah, brilliant.
It's been really, really great.
Thanks, guys. It was really great. Really great.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
Thanks to everyone.
It's always weird this at the end of the Zoom, isn't it? So I think, yeah, people will start ducking out now. But thank you so much, both of you. Really, really, really brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great. Lovely to see you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. See you later.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.